Good morning, Year 10, and welcome to the third of our sessions on unseen poetry. I just want to start a little bit by focusing on answering responses in the exam. On the screen at the moment, you can see the question that we looked at in last week's session, looking at the two love poems, First Love and Valentine. Already I've had a few responses from the first week, based on the school poems, First Day at School and The School in August. And one thing that became pretty clear from those responses is that students have spent as much time on the comparison 8-mark question as they had on the question on the first named poem. Now, although I stress that that is important, remember there are 24 marks available for your analysis of the first named poem. So if you haven't completed this question yet and submitted it to me, bear in mind that 27.1 is worth 24 marks. So the bulk of your time should be spent answering that question and analysing that main poem. The 8-mark question, which is 27.2, is your comparison question. Obviously, I want you to do as well as you possibly can on that, but you are making a big mistake in terms of exam technique if you have done a response for the comparison question that's of equal length to your response for 27.1. Now, you need to write as much as you can for 27.1 in the time available. I would say perhaps 30 minutes on 27.1 and perhaps 10-15 minutes on the comparison question, and you should be getting it just about right. But certainly I shouldn't be expecting responses to 27.2, although I do want to see extended responses if possibly can. But you shouldn't expect to be seeing answers of a similar length to those for 27.1. Okay, so if you haven't done that exam response yet, please do. I know some people had a little bit of trouble accessing the work on the groups part of Microsoft Outlook, and hopefully my email this week will have sorted that problem out. So just a quick reminder before we look at the questions that I set for you to look at for planning purposes this week, of checking your work and making sure that you're covering all aspects of assessment. AO1 is about your ideas, AO2 is about writers' methods and techniques, and you need to integrate all those aspects into your response. And they are dependent on each other. If you don't have ideas that answer the question, even if you pick out a number of different techniques that you use, you can't really adequately answer the question if you don't have the ideas to link them to. Similarly, a response which has brilliant ideas, but you don't actually support anything of what you say with reference to writers' methods in terms of language and structure, is going to be wanting as well. You need to make sure that those things are all present in your response. Okay, so I won't spend a load of time going over the different individual aspects again, and we will try and illustrate the points I'm making through reference to the two poems on the board at the moment. Now, if you haven't yet done the planning part of the work that I set last week, now is your opportunity to do it. So what I'm going to do is look at the first poem here, Aging Schoolmaster. I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to ask you to pause the video for 5 minutes and have a go at answering the question. As in previous sessions, the important thing is the question. So in Aging Schoolmaster, how does the poet present the speaker's feelings of old age? Now notice it talks about the speaker. So you have to decide who the speaker is. It may or may not be the voice of the poet. So you have to make that decision based on the evidence there in front of you. Now the focus is how the person speaking feels about old age. So you've got to have the ideas there. Now when you've got the ideas, you need to then unpick the techniques that are used by Vernon Scannell, the poet in this particular case, to communicate those feelings. Okay, so we're looking for specific examples quoted from the poem, but also reference to different techniques, and they can be techniques to do with use of language, but also techniques to do with structure, rhyme scheme, number of stanzas, all the different technical things about how it looks on the page. Okay, so as I've said, focus on the question, and it's all about speakers' feelings about old age. So I'm going to read the poem first, and then I'm going to pause or ask you to pause the video and do a little bit of planning. Can't make you do that. You might just skip straight on to the next slide and see the ideas that I came up with. But really, if you want to properly stretch yourself, please pause the video and have a go yourself. Okay. Aging schoolmaster. And now another autumn morning finds me with chalk dust on my sleeve and in my breath, preoccupied with vague, habitual speculation on the huge inevitability of death. Not wholly wretched, yet knowing absolutely that I shall never reacquaint myself with joy, I sniff the smell of ink and chalk and my mortality, and think of when I rolled, a gormless boy, and rollicked round the playground of my hours, and wonder when precisely tolled the bell which summoned me from summer liberties and brought me to this chill autumnal cell, from which I gaze upon the April faces that gleam before me like apples ranged on shelves, and yet I feel no pinch or prick of envy, nor would I have them know their sentence selves. With careful effort I can separate the faces, the dull, the clever, the various shapes and sizes, but in the autumn shades I find I only brood upon death, which carries off all the prizes. Okay, so that's the poem. Please pause the video, see what you can come up with. Okay, by now you should have had the opportunity to get some ideas down for this particular poem, and I'm just going to run through a few of the things that I came up with. As I've said in previous sessions, don't look at these ideas and think, oh, I haven't got those, therefore I've got it wrong. As I've said before, just because your ideas aren't on this page does not mean that the ideas aren't valid. When you write your full response in the exam, you need to be able to have confidence in what you're saying. Now, provided you are focusing in on what the focus of the question is and you can support what you're saying, you should be able to pick up marks for coming up with valid interpretations. Now, the first thing that struck me about this poem, and I'm kind of changing my mind all the time as I think about it, but clearly this is very much from the perspective of someone who is facing death. So I would say that the speaker in the poem is consumed by the inevitability of his own death, and it's not really the voice of the poet, it's a created voice. So it's the two things at the top there in blue, we've got is consumed by the inevitability of his own death. In other words, he's so focused on it that ironically the life that he loves so much he no longer has the ability to enjoy. There is a sense in which he kind of, he does say that he doesn't envy people who still have their youth. You begin to question whether that's really true or not, because it is someone who feels very kind of weary and burdened with the kind of imminence of death. That there's nothing he can do to stop it, and all around him, because he's a school teacher, he sees these young people and he doesn't envy them. Now, perhaps he does. Perhaps that's something that you might actually question, because not all voices in poems or literary texts are reliable, so you might think he doesn't envy them, but the evidence in the poem might suggest otherwise. I'm sure you've heard the expression, I think thou doth protest too much. It's from Shakespeare, and it certainly seems that he is trying to go out of his way to pretend he isn't jealous, but the jealousy comes through, and he talks about himself as when he was a gormless boy and didn't know about his mortality, almost as though the ignorance is something that he wished he still had, that he could enjoy life if he was ignorant of mortality and things coming to an end. So it's very bleak, I think, the perspective of this poem. I've put there in my notes, weary and burdened. It's definitely somebody who is the life's being consumed by their inability to stop thinking about death. Now, come up with 6 different things that you could comment on, and I'll just run through them. So one of the things that came across very strongly for me is that there are a lot of words that suggest obsessiveness. Now, if you've got words that have a connection, you can use the phrase semantic field. A semantic field is basically a series of words across a text that are linked in some way. So I've picked out 4 things here that suggest obsessiveness. We've got that word there, preoccupied. So preoccupied with vague habitual speculation on the huge inevitability of death. If you're preoccupied with something, it means that you can't move on, that something is on your mind all the time. So, that suggests someone who isn't living a life, doesn't it? Habitual as well, the adjective there. If something's habitual, it's a habit, it's something you can't break, it's something you do all the time. So again, suggesting someone who can't shake off the obsession with death. And similarly, brooded upon. If you brood on something, it means you worry about it a lot. And then inevitability as well, suggesting something that you can't stop. So there's quite a lot that you can say about each of those words to develop an answer that talks about his feelings about old age, because all of those things suggest someone who isn't comfortable with the idea of growing old and isn't comfortable with the idea of dying. Linked with that, we've got the repetition in the poem of, well, there are 2 stanzas that begin with the word and the poem itself begins with the word and I think that in itself seems to suggest that this is a kind of stage in his life where he can't stop things, and now another autumn morning finds me, almost as though it's run. The start of the poem is kind of the end of a story rather than the beginning, because beginning with "and" suggests that life has already been lived, and this is like picking it up kind of part way between, in fact well past part way, most of the way along the journey. So it's an interesting technique there, starting those verses with "and," this idea of not being able to stop things, and is an addition, isn't it? There's also a couple of extended metaphors which are interesting in this poem. We've got references to the seasons, and there's a strong contrast in the way a season is mentioned, with youth very much being seen as the summertime, the summer liberties implying freedom. Whereas in contrast to that, is in it the autumn now. Say winter perhaps is death, autumn is the final years representing aging, and in addition to the seasons, we've got the reference to the cell, so almost like a prison cell, and that's repeated in the idea lower down of autumn shades. The darkness that comes across as things come to an end. In contrast as well, he references the children's faces as April faces. Obviously, April is the 4th month of the year, suggesting youth. So that use of that kind of language to represent the idea of aging is really powerful as well. Also linked to that, if you want to talk about figurative language, we've got the use of personification of death right at the very end. Death who carries off all the prizes. And the prize is life, isn't it? This is someone who prizes life. But as I said before, there's a huge irony in this poem, because it's somebody who's not actually living their life. They're still alive, but they've become so obsessed that they're not able to live it. The final 2 examples I've picked here are to do, I suppose, with structural things. Now, you will notice highlighted on the end in those green blobs are a particular number of lines. There's 10 lines there. The thing that they all have in common is that they don't have a piece of punctuation at the end. So that's enjambment. And what it suggests there is when you read the poem, you're not supposed to pause at the end of the line. So if you pause, it would be much easier to read, because obviously if there's a breathlessness created by not pausing, what the author's trying to show is that this is a breathlessness that the man might feel about his life ebbing away so quickly. Now, in particular, if you look at the 3rd verse, that's a huge one, because right in the middle there we've got 3 examples of enjambment, and the verse itself starts with an "and." So if I just reread that, you can see the effect of it. and rollicked round the playground of my hours, and wondered when precisely tolled the bell which summoned me from the summer liberties and brought me to this chill autumnal cell from which I gaze upon the April faces that gleam before me. Now, it's only when you get to the word before me, where there's a comma, that you feel like you can take a little bit of a breath. And I think what the poet is trying to replicate there is this fear that the aging schoolmaster has about the passage of time and his inability to stop it. So, and Jean Mont worked really well to emphasize the inevitability and the speed of the passage of time, but also actually reading it makes you feel breathless, because you have to take a big breath to get through all those lines if you're going to read it to the punctuation, which is what you should do when you are reading poetry. So a really powerful use of form there to mimic the feelings of the aging schoolmaster. Also linked to form is the structure itself. So if you look on the page, you can see there are 5 stanzas of uniform number of lines. In fact, I better make sure we've got the slide there correct. So it is actually 5 uniform 4-line stanzas. In addition to that, you will also notice that we have alternate rhyming lines, which gives a kind of a rhythm to the poem, which again you could link in with the inevitability of time passing. The interesting thing for me, though, if you look at the words that do rhyme, if you look at the juxtaposition of them, it's interesting. So we've got breath and death. You know, breath representing life, and death, obviously, the opposite, the absence of life. And then we've got the juxtaposition of joy and boy. You know, the idea of youth represented by boy being associated with happiness. And then bell and cell, because a bell represents death as well, because in literature, a bell tolling quite often is used as a symbol of death, but cell obviously is a prison cell. So it's interesting that those juxtapositions also mimic his attitude to life and death as well. Again, shelves and cells, like he feels like he's been abandoned, left on the shelf. So you know, if you talked about the rhyming words and talked about the juxtaposition, that's a really quite a high level idea that you could bring into your response as well. Okay, so think about the ideas that we've come up with there, and you might use some of those in your response, or perhaps you can you've got even better ideas yourself that you can bring in. Okay, so the next task is to look at the second question. And the second question is the comparison question. So as it with before, I'm going to read the poem first, just the second one this time, extract from geography lesson. And I want you to pause the video after I finish reading and see what comparison ideas you can come up with between these 2 poems. So the question, because as we've said numerous times, it's really important to know what you're comparing. So in both Aging Schoolmaster and Geography Lesson, the speakers describe school teachers. What are the similarities and or differences between the way the poets present these teachers? Okay, so we're just looking at extract from Geography Lesson first of all, and then thinking about the differences in the way the teacher is presented here compared with the way he's presented, the other teachers presented in Aging Schoolmaster. Extract from Geography Lesson. Our teacher told us one day he would leave and sail across a warm blue sea to places he had only known from maps, and all his life had longed to be. The house he lived in was narrow and grey, but in his mind's eye he could see sweet-scented jasmine clinging to the walls and green leaves burning on an orange tree. He spoke of the lands he longed to visit, where it was never drab or cold. I couldn't understand why he never left and shook off the school's stranglehold. Okay, so if you just want to pause the video, you are making comparisons. So what are the similarities and differences in the way the 2 teachers in these 2 poems are presented? So you just spend a couple of minutes getting some ideas down. Now try to think of ideas that are both language-based as well as structural ideas. So what does the poem look like on the page? Can you see any similarities in the mark scheme or anything else about the way the poems are presented that you can draw some points of similarity and some points of difference from? Okay, by now you should have had some chance to point out the similarities and differences between the two poems. I'm just going to run through some of the ideas that I came up with. Again, as before, don't panic if you haven't said the same things as me. It's not a problem at all, provided you've got some ideas of your own. This is the 8-mark question. So again, I've got a lot of ideas on the screen here. You wouldn't have the time in the exam to write about every single one. So you just need to get used to identifying perhaps a couple of language points and a structure point to get your 8 marks. So I think one of the key things about this poem that strikes me is that the speaker's quite different, because in the first poem it's very much a created character. It's the actual aging schoolmaster himself who's speaking, whereas this seems to be very much from the point of view of somebody looking back at one of their teachers and wondering about where things went wrong for them, because it's very much about the teacher's dreams that they had, and the dreams they've obviously shared with the students. And then clearly we're not told what happened to the teacher in the geography lesson, but clearly we do know that he didn't ever do the things that he always planned to do as he got older. And there's a very much a sense of kind of disbelief, confusion, and regret there at the end, that he didn't really escape being a teacher. And we've got that final line there, in fact final couple of lines: I couldn't understand why he never left and shook off the school stranglehold, which seems to suggest that this man's dreams were never really realised. So, his old age, perhaps death took him before he was able to take advantage of retirement and do the things that he always thought, planned he would do, that he'd obviously shared with the kids that he dreamed about. So, yeah, it's a different perspective, obviously, because it's not the teacher himself saying these things. This is somebody else looking back, so it doesn't have quite the same immediacy as the previous poem, because in Aging Schoolmaster we actually hear his voice. I think one of the key messages for me here, though, is that I think what the poet's trying to say is that we spend our lives thinking about dreams that we want to fulfill when we're older, but that life gets in the way, and sometimes we don't really achieve them. And in a way, it's quite bleak in that regard. The description of the dreams themselves is quite warm and beautiful, but the payoff at the end of the poem is quite bleak. The fact that he never managed to get away, it's particularly that last line: it shook off the school's stranglehold. That metaphor, the idea of him, the life being strangled out of him, and the S's there, the hissing of the S's, perhaps creating a sinister feel there. But yeah, overall, I think quite a bleak poem. But what you have to do is make some comparisons. So that's the focus that you should have. So I already talked about the first one, the narrative perspectives. So Aging Schoolmaster is in the present tense, it's first person, and therefore it's more immediate. Whereas the geography lesson, we don't really know how old the speaker is. I assume it's someone who has long left school. So this teacher that they're talking about has perhaps died. You get the impression that the speaker's actually an adult, and he's talking about a teacher from when he was much younger. But the perspective is certainly quite different and suggests a passage of time, it's something in the past. They both also, I think, touch on, to differing degrees, the idea of prisons. We've got the reference in here to the description of his house. I mean, it is supposed to be a literal description, but it's also used metaphorically. The house he lived in was narrow and grey, so that's literal. But in his mind's eye, you could see sweet-scented jasmine clinging to the walls. So you can see how, that's very much described like a prison. But it's also kind of touched on metaphorically, because in his imagination, it becomes something much more beautiful. In his dreams, it becomes something much more beautiful. And that's something he never achieved. So this idea of life as a prison, I think, is mirrored in the description of the geography teacher's house. Now, in the first poem, in Aging Schoolmaster, obviously the idea of a prison is referenced with autumnal cells. So you can see there where the similarities are between the two poems. Enjambment is used in both poems as well. I think in both it's used to show how life kind of is something that you can't stop. So obviously in Aging Schoolmaster it's the inevitable march of time. But here, the enjambment is actually used in the first 4 lines to show how amazing the dreams are. So it's actually used in quite a contrasting way. So we've got those first 3 lines where there isn't a piece of punctuation till after the word map. So our teacher told us one day he would leave and sail across a warm blue sea to places he had known from maps. And then a little bit lower down, the house he lived in was narrow and grey, but in his mind's eye he could see sweet scented jasmine clinging to the walls. So the enjambment there is where the dreams come in, and they help the kind of dreamlike feeling of the poem as well. And the final comparison we have there is the rhyme scheme, which is very similar for both poems. And what we've got is the alternate rhyming lines. So in this particular poem, if you look, we've got the second line in each pair rhyming. So C and B, sea and tree, cold and stranglehold. So again, showing the inevitable march of time. So I think that's something that you can obviously draw out in your comparison. That they are both really about poems where the subjects in question don't really get to enjoy old age, so they do have some strong similarities. I think the key difference is in this one is somebody else reflecting on the teacher, whereas in the previous one it's the teacher himself who seems kind of lost in life, and it's in many ways it's more direct because he's speaking himself. So in your similarities and differences between the way the poets present these teachers, it's really important that your focus is on getting those ideas across, as well as linking it to the techniques used by the writers. That's the last of the poems that we're going to look at in detail, but what I would like you to do once more is to have a go at doing 27.1 and 27.2 responses to those questions that are on the screen there. The second task I would like you to complete this week is to complete a full exam response to the 2 poems on the screen, which are both war poems. Dulce et Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen and Attack by Siegfried Sassoon. Now, I'm not giving you any clues about any language points or anything from here. The whole idea of this is for you to think about what we've done over the past couple of weeks and apply the skills that we've talked about yourself. All I will do is read the poems out so you've got a sense of how they should be read. Okay, so first of all, Dulce et Decorum Est. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling, and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his hanging face like a devil sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. And the second of the 2 poems is Attack by Siegfried Sassoon. At dawn the ridge emerges massed and dun in the wild purple of the glowering sun, smouldering through spouts of drifting smoke that shroud the menacing scarred slope. And one by one tanks creep and topple forward to the wire. The barrage roars and lifts. Then, clumsily bowed, with bombs and guns and shovels and battle gear, men jostle and climb to meet the bristling fire. Lines of grey, muttering faces, masked with fear. They leave their trenches, going over the top, while time ticks blank and busy on their wrists, and hope, with furtive eyes and grappling fists, flounders in mud. Oh, Jesus, make it stop.